Welcome, dear viewers. Tonight, step carefully, because the moment you cross this threshold, you're no longer looking at history as you once knew it. You're entering a world where the impossible was accepted as ordinary, where cruelty was masked as curiosity, and where millions of people, ordinary citizens, cheered at the sight of something we now recognize as deeply horrifying. This is the opening chapter in the long, shadowed saga of human zoos. Exhibitions where real men, women, and even children were placed on display like living trophies. And before we dive into the cages and the crowds, we must understand how a world that considered itself civilized built an industry of dehumanization so vast, so profitable, and so normalized that it shaped the beliefs of generations. To understand the rise of human zoos, we must return to the 19th century. A time when Europe and America believed they were the apex of human progress. Steam engines howled through cities, telegraph lines stitched continents together, and new sciences promised to explain everything: the mind, the body, even the value of entire civilizations. This period, often celebrated as an age of discovery and innovation, holds another legacy, one far darker. It was an era obsessed not only with advancement, but with classification. People were not just people. They were categories to be studied, ranked, and displayed. This obsession was fueled by the booming empire-building ambitions of the world's major powers. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and the United States seized territories across Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, claiming lands and lives under the banner of enlightenment. They called it civilizing. But in truth, they were extracting resources and exploiting people, all while constructing a narrative that justified their dominance. That narrative hinged on one belief: that Europeans were the pinnacle of human evolution, while everyone else existed somewhere below. Scientific racism, rooted in twisted interpretations of Darwinism and the fraudulent science of phrenology, offered a convenient rationale. Scholars measured skulls, dissected features, and invented hierarchies that placed white Europeans above all other populations. The world didn't just accept these theories, they embraced them. And once you convince society that certain humans are inferior, the leap toward exhibiting them like wildlife becomes disturbingly short. In the mid-1850s, the seeds were planted. The first ethnographic villages appeared in European cities, promoted as educational spectacles where visitors could experience the world's so-called primitive peoples without ever leaving home. These displays were marketed as windows into distant cultures, but behind the glossy posters and patriotic rhetoric lay a bizarre fusion of science, colonial propaganda, and mass entertainment. Paris, a city priding itself on being the center of art and intellect, became one of the epicenters. It hosted small gatherings where individuals from Africa or the Pacific Islands were placed inside fenced enclosures replicating their supposed natural habitats. They were instructed to perform daily routines: cooking, weaving, dancing, or hunting, all for the amusement of wealthy visitors who wandered past with parasols and catalogs, whispering observations as if they were touring a garden of strange flora. Hamburg followed suit, erecting larger and more elaborate exhibitions. These early displays were not yet called human zoos, not officially. They were presented as educational ethnological experiences. But even then, the truth was clear. People were being reduced to props. To the public, these displays were thrilling. Newspapers encouraged their participation by feeding them sensational stories about tribes untouched by civilization. Artists romanticized these exhibitions, depicting the displayed individuals as mysterious, beautiful, dangerous, or childlike. The more dehumanizing the portrayal, the more tickets sold. And so the crowds flocked. Families brought children. Couples walked through the exhibitions as part of a weekend outing. Scholars toured them with notebooks in hand. What should have sparked horror instead ignited fascination. By this time, Europe had fully accepted a worldview where imperial power meant moral authority. The belief that non-European cultures were lesser wasn't just opinion, it was the social norm, taught in schools and preached from political platforms. When explorers and colonizers returned home with stories of distant peoples, they did not describe them as allies or sovereign communities. They described them as curiosities, as remnants of humanity's past, as living fossils representing stages of evolution that Europeans believed they had surpassed. And so the stage was set. The first act of this global spectacle was underway. Behind the scenes, something more sinister was happening. The transformation of human life into commodity. Entrepreneurs and showmen recognized a lucrative opportunity. If displaying animals was profitable, how much more captivating would it be to present living humans from distant worlds, especially those portrayed as exotic or wild? This idea gave birth to a new industry. Contracts, often fraudulent or coercive, were drawn up. Colonial officers and soldiers participated in recruitment. In some cases, entire groups were persuaded to travel abroad with promises of fair payment and short-term engagements. In other cases, people were kidnapped. When they arrived in Europe, they were strangers in a land that viewed them as objects of wonder. They understood little of the language and even less of the culture. Many believed they were participating in some sort of cultural exchange, unaware that they would be placed in cages, scrutinized, mocked, or studied like specimens. As these human exhibits grew in number, the public began to demand more. Crowds wanted authenticity as they defined it. They wanted to see primitive life as they imagined it. To satisfy this appetite, organizers staged theatrical scenes, mock hunts, ritual dances, weddings, even fights. Every hour became a performance, whether those within the enclosures agreed or not. The participants were instructed to wear stereotypical costumes, even if those items had no connection to their real traditions. Diets were changed, behaviors enforced, and schedules rigidly controlled. The goal was to fit the expectations of the audience, no matter how inaccurate or degrading those expectations were. And the audience loved it. Within a few decades, Europe became the center of a booming human exhibition circuit. Some displays were small, hosted inside zoos or museums. Others were enormous, featured at international expositions that attracted millions of visitors from around the world. These exhibitions shaped public beliefs about entire ethnic groups. Europeans and Americans who had never encountered people from Africa, the Americas, the Pacific, or Asia formed their first impressions through these distorted displays. They believed they were witnessing reality. What they were actually seeing was a constructed illusion, a theatrical performance designed to reinforce colonial ideology. The displayed individuals, whether Sami reindeer herders, Nubian warriors, Inuit families, or Aboriginal Australians, became symbols of a world Europeans claimed to understand and dominate. Their humanity was systematically stripped away, replaced by labels, props, and narratives crafted by showmen. As the phenomenon spread, a chilling transformation took place. What began as a handful of ethnographic displays evolved into a massive entertainment industry. Cities competed to host the largest, most exotic village. Showmen scoured the globe for new groups to exhibit, and colonial governments supported these efforts, using them to justify imperial rule. Look, they said, at how different they are. Look at how simple their lives seem. Look at how much they need our guidance. It was manipulation on a grand scale, a public illusion designed to make empire appear not as domination, but as benevolence. And here lies the darkest truth. Millions of people believed it. Human zoos were not fringe attractions. They were mainstream, respectable, celebrated, even beloved.
By the time the 19th century drew to a close, human zoos had become a defining feature of Western culture. They influenced art, anthropology, science, and politics. They shaped views on race, identity, and civilization. They framed an entire world's understanding of human diversity. This is the world in which the story of human zoos begins. Not in the cages, but in the minds of the societies that built them. A world convinced of its superiority. A world eager to be entertained. A world blind to the suffering it caused. As the curtain rises on this global spectacle, the stage is set for what will become one of the most disturbing chapters in human history. And with this foundation laid, we move forward to the grand fairs where human exhibits would explode into mainstream fascination, drawing crowds in the millions and forever reshaping how nations viewed the people they colonized. Welcome back. Tonight, the world grows louder. The crowds are gathering. The bright banners of international expositions are unfurling across the great capitals of Europe, calling millions toward a spectacle unlike anything seen before. And it is here, amid these grand world fairs, celebrations of progress, innovation, and civilization, that the dark phenomenon of human zoos explodes into the global stage, becoming not just entertainment, but a defining cultural force. By the late 1800s, the world had become intoxicated by the idea of global exhibitions. Cities like Paris, London, Brussels, and Chicago competed fiercely to host these monumental events, constructing massive fairgrounds filled with palaces of industry, fountains of lighting powered by new electricity, and towering monuments that symbolized the peak of human achievement. The fairs promised wonder. Machines that could knit garments in minutes, engines that could pull entire trains, foods from distant continents, and architectural marvels that defied imagination. But beneath this glittering celebration of human advancement was a hunger for something else, a hunger for the exotic, the unfamiliar, the primitive. And the organizers knew exactly how to satisfy it. In 1889, Paris unveiled the Exposition Universelle, an event so colossal that it would be etched permanently into history. To many, it was the fair that introduced the Eiffel Tower to the world, a monument of steel that pierced the sky and symbolized modern progress. But the tower was only one part of the story. Tucked behind its iron legs was something far more haunting, a sprawling human village. An exhibit that would draw nearly 28 million visitors. Its paths twisted through wooden huts built in the style of distant continents: Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Oceania. Inside these spaces lived the people displayed as part of the exhibition. Senegalese, Algerians, Vietnamese, Kanaks from New Caledonia, and other colonized groups, all brought here to represent the living trophies of France's empire. They were instructed to move naturally, to cook, dance, sing, weave, and construct, but every action was performed under the weight of thousands of staring eyes.
Visitors wandered through these pseudo-villages, whispering, pointing, and gasping as though they had stepped into a living diorama. The organizers told them it was education, but what they were truly witnessing was the staged performance of human lives, molded to fit the fantasies of empire. For many Europeans, this was their first encounter with people from beyond the continent. Their impressions, formed in these crowded, artificial spaces, would shape their beliefs for decades. Newspapers sensationalized the displays, describing the performers with dehumanizing fascination. Illustrations showed them as fierce, simple, or childlike. Articles insisted that the exhibitions proved European superiority, reinforcing the narrative that colonization was benevolent, necessary, and justified. The crowds believed it. But the Paris Fair was only the beginning. Across Europe, other cities saw the success and raced to replicate it. Berlin, Hamburg, Copenhagen, and Milan all built elaborate exhibitions boasting living displays of colonized peoples. Belgium, eager to advertise its brutal colonization of the Congo, erected massive villages filled with Congolese men, women, and children, many of whom would die from cold, malnutrition, and disease before the fair even ended. Germany's Karl Hagenbeck, the famed animal exhibitor, saw the rise of the Paris human village and recognized a lucrative opportunity. He expanded his touring exotic shows, transporting groups from Africa, Asia, and the Arctic across Europe. Unlike the static displays of the fairs, Hagenbeck's exhibitions moved from city to city, drawing crowds in the millions and turning human display into a profitable industry. He treated people as he treated animals in his menagerie, another species to be caged, fed, transported, and presented. His exhibits featured Nubian warriors, Inuit families, Sami reindeer herders, and Aboriginal Australians, often forced to perform staged rituals that fit European stereotypes. And the public applauded. Meanwhile, the United States watched Europe's success and prepared to build spectacles of its own. At the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the United States constructed the Philippine Reservation, a vast exhibition featuring more than 1,000 people forcibly brought from the recently colonized Philippines. It was the largest human zoo ever created on American soil, built explicitly to prove the U.S.'s claim that it was civilizing its new territory.
Each ethnic group was given labels. Costume designers altered or replaced traditional clothing to make them appear more exotic. Performances were scheduled throughout the day. Mock battles, dances, cooking demonstrations, and even staged schools, showing Filipinos supposedly being taught the ways of modern life. The crowds came in waves, more than 20 million people in total, walking through the Philippine reservation as casually as one might stroll through a botanical garden. They took photographs, bought postcards, and left with the belief that their government's imperial ambitions were righteous. One of the most disturbing attractions at St. Louis was the so-called Igorot village, where tribal people from the Philippines were instructed to perform dog-eating rituals on schedule, something exaggerated or outright fabricated to shock American audiences. The press sensationalized the display, calling the Igorot savages in need of civilization. The story dominated headlines across the nation. This was not education. This was engineered propaganda. The human exhibits at these fairs were meticulously curated illusions, constructed to present colonized peoples as primitive and helpless. Every detail was crafted to reassure visitors of their own superiority, and the more the crowd stared, the more they believed. From Paris to St. Louis, from Berlin to Brussels, the World Fairs transformed human zoos from small exhibits into cultural landmarks,
Millions of visitors, newspapers, scientists, artists, politicians, and scholars all participated in this mass spectacle. It became a form of entertainment so normalized that few questioned its morality. Children grew up visiting human zoos. Parents brought families. Teachers organized school trips. Photographers took keepsakes. In the middle of this whirlwind of celebration and spectacle, the people inside the cages lived a very different reality. Most were isolated in cramped quarters, exposed to unfamiliar climates, forced into repetitive performances, and deprived of medical care. Poverty and disease were rampant. Many were not paid as promised or paid nothing at all. Their languages, customs, and identities were misrepresented or mocked. They were cut off from their homelands, uncertain if they would ever return. Some were so traumatized that they refused to speak for days or hid from visitors between performances. Others tried to escape, only to be dragged back and punished. Deaths were common, especially among children. Yet the visitors rarely knew or cared what happened behind the scenes. The fairs wrapped these horrors in the shimmering cloak of celebration. They were grand events, symbols of national pride and scientific achievement. Politicians gave speeches among the artificial villages. Scientists walked through them recording measurements and sketches. Artists painted the performers in exaggerated poses. Journalists wrote romanticized articles.
And slowly, a dangerous idea solidified in the public mind. That human difference was not diversity. It was hierarchy. That civilization could be measured. That some people were closer to animals than others. This idea would seep into schools, policy, and culture, fueling segregation, forced assimilation, and racial violence for generations. But for now, the world was still cheering. And as the lights of the fairs grew brighter, as the crowds swelled larger, as the industry boomed, one truth became undeniable. Human zoos had become global. And soon, an individual would emerge whose story would define the darkest depths of this phenomenon. A man whose life would be transformed into a spectacle so cruel, so blatant, so shocking, that even in a world desensitized by human exhibitions, he would become a symbol of the industry's inhumanity. His name was Ota Benga, and his cage would not stand in a fairground village, but inside a zoo's monkey house. Welcome back. Tonight's chapter is not merely dark history, it is a wound that never truly healed. Because in the long, tragic saga of human zoos, one name stands above all others, echoing through time with unbearable weight. A name whispered in every archive and remembered in every discussion of racial dehumanization. Ota Benga, a man whose life was stolen, packaged, and displayed for the amusement of a world that believed itself enlightened. A man who lived inside a cage, and whose story forces us to confront the deepest rot in the foundations of modern civilization. To understand Ota Benga, we must journey first to the forests of the Congo Free State in the early 1900s, an era shaped by one of the most brutal colonial regimes to ever exist. Belgium's King Leopold II claimed the Congo as his personal property, not a colony of the crown, but a private empire of ivory and rubber. Under his rule, millions died from forced labor, massacres, starvation, torture, and disease. The land into which Ota Benga was born was bleeding. He was a member of the Mbuti people, often called forest dwellers, one of several groups living in the Ituri rainforest. They were expert hunters, deeply tied to the natural world. Their traditions were rich, their knowledge of the forest unparalleled. But none of this mattered to the men invading their lands with rifles and quotas. It was during one of these violent incursions that Ota Benga's life was shattered. The colonial forces attacked his village. His wife and children were killed. Accounts differ on whether he was captured or sold into captivity shortly after. But what is certain is that his fate became entangled with that of an American explorer named Samuel Werner.
Werner came to the Congo in search of specimens. The St. Louis World's Fair was only months away, and fair organizers wanted authentic tribespeople from Africa, an exhibit that would draw vast crowds and reinforce the belief in Western superiority. Werner was tasked with bringing them back. And so he found Ota Benga, widowed, grieving, traumatized. Werner claimed he bought Ota Benga's freedom, but freedom was never offered. Instead, Ota Benga was transported across the world, thrust into a spectacle he did not understand. When he arrived at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, he was added to the Anthropology Village, an enormous exhibit of people from Africa, the Philippines, the Americas, and Asia. Organizers placed him with other Central African individuals as part of a display meant to represent early stages of human evolution. Every gesture, every movement, every breath he took was watched. Crowds pointed at his sharpened teeth, teeth that were part of Mubiti cultural identity, and newspapers sensationalized them as signs of savagery. They described him as small, subhuman, almost animalistic. People lined up to stare. Children laughed. Adults mocked. Photographers posed him with spears he had never used and in costumes he had never worn. And through it all, Ota Benga remained silent, watching the endless parade of strangers observing him as one might observe a rare creature in a cage. When the St. Louis Fair ended, Werner brought Ota Benga with him to Virginia, but there was no home waiting for him, only uncertainty. Werner struggled financially, and in a desperate move, he placed Ota Benga in the Bronx Zoo in New York City. And there, the darkest chapter began. The Bronx Zoo was immensely popular at the time, attracting thousands of visitors each week. Its director, William Hornaday, was obsessed with evolutionary science. He believed the zoo should not only entertain, but teach visitors about the natural world and, disturbingly, about human evolution as well. So when Werner suggested displaying Ota Benga alongside the apes, Hornaday agreed. On September 8, 1906, the Bronx Zoo placed Ota Benga inside the monkey house. They dressed him in a white suit, straw hat, and bare feet. They gave him a bow and arrow. They instructed him to perform archery demonstrations. And when he grew tired and sat quietly, the zoo placed him inside the actual cage of the orangutan named Dohong. A sign was hung outside the enclosure. The African pygmy, Ota Benga, age 23, height 4 feet 11 inches. No mention of his culture. No mention of his humanity. No mention of the wife and children he had lost. Just measurements, like an exhibit in a museum of natural history. Crowds surged in. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Spectators laughed and shoved each other to get closer. Some threw peanuts, others taunted him. Children mimicked him. Adults banged on the bars of his cage. Within days, more than 40,000 people came to see him. And the zoo was delighted. They defended the exhibit, insisting it was educational. They claimed it demonstrated the connection between Africans and early humans. The zoo director wrote to newspapers, arguing that objections were coming from people who simply did not understand science. But objections did come, loud and furious. Black churches in New York were the first to raise their voices. Ministers condemned the exhibit from their pulpits, calling it a crime against humanity. They demanded his release. They organized protests. They wrote to the mayor and to newspapers across the country. "How dare you," one reverend thundered, "place a man in a cage next to an ape and call it enlightenment?" Under increasing pressure, the zoo eventually removed Ota Benga from the cage, but not immediately. Before doing so, they moved him through the zoo grounds, encouraging him to walk among crowds as a free exhibit. They kept him on display for weeks. Finally, after relentless protests, Ota Benga was released into the custody of the very church leaders who had fought for him. He was sent to an orphanage in Brooklyn, then later to Lynchburg, Virginia, where he lived with host families and attended school. For the first time in years, he tasted something resembling peace. But peace could not erase trauma. He longed for home, for the forests of the Congo, for the life stolen from him. He saved money to return to Africa, but every attempt was blocked by war, by bureaucracy, by the simple fact that the world had forgotten him. Over time, his grief deepened into despair. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. His laughter faded. His eyes dulled. On March 20th, 1916, Ota Benga walked into the woods behind the house where he lived. He built a small ceremonial fire, broke his last possessions, and ended his life with a single gunshot. He was 32 years old. His grave bore no name, only the memory of a man the world had caged. Today, museums refuse to display his remains. Historians still argue over the details of his life. The Bronx Zoo has never formally apologized. But Ota Benga's story remains a symbol, an undeniable testament to the cruelty hidden beneath the polished veneer of early modern civilization. His life exposes the core truth behind human zoos. These were not harmless exhibitions or scientific studies. They were acts of domination, humiliation, and violence. Ota Benga was not alone, but he is the face the world cannot forget. Tonight, the story widens. The spotlight leaves the United States and swings back across the Atlantic, where Europe, hungry for spectacle, power, and the thrill of the unfamiliar, constructed a vast empire of human exhibitions. If the World Fairs were the beating heart of this phenomenon, then the touring savage shows of Europe were its veins, carrying the same poisonous fascination from city to city, year after year, generation after generation. Here in the grand boulevards of Paris, the bustling ports of Hamburg, the quiet squares of Copenhagen, and the proud avenues of Berlin, human beings were not just displayed, they were branded, marketed, turned into living theater. And nowhere is this more evident than in the chilling legacy of one man, Carl Hagenbeck, the German entrepreneur who revolutionized the world of human zoos and helped transform them from occasional attractions into a global industry. But before diving into Hagenbeck's empire, we must take a step back and understand the landscape of Europe at the time. Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was intoxicated by imperialism. Countries raced to claim colonies, carve up continents, and assert dominance over peoples they viewed as lesser. Newspapers brimmed with stories of conquest, politicians boasted of their expanding empires, and ordinary citizens, many who had never left their hometowns, absorbed these narratives without question. They wanted to see the world, and showmen promised to bring the world to them. Human exhibitions, at first modest displays tucked inside gardens or botanical institutions, soon ballooned into massive commercial spectacles. Entire villages were imported, staged, and populated by people uprooted from their homes. Some came willingly under the promise of payment. Some were coerced. Many were outright kidnapped. Once in Europe, they were placed on display in environments carefully engineered to resemble the natural habitats Europeans imagined. African performers were placed in dusty artificial savannas, Arctic people surrounded by fake ice and painted glaciers, Pacific Islanders in fabricated tropical huts under paper palms. These scenes were not built for authenticity, but for fantasy. And Carl Hagenbeck knew how to sell a fantasy.
Before rising to fame as one of the world's most influential zoo designers, Hagenbeck was already a prominent animal trader. He captured lions, elephants, polar bears, and countless other animals for European zoos. His empire thrived on the exotic, the unusual, the dangerous. But animals alone were not enough. Hagenbeck understood the public's growing fascination with people from distant lands, so he expanded his business model. Instead of merely delivering animals, he delivered human beings. His first major human exhibition launched in 1874. It featured Sami people from northern Scandinavia, men and women dressed in furs, surrounded by reindeer, constructing tents of stretched hide. European audiences, most of whom had no knowledge of Europe's own indigenous populations, were captivated. To them, the Sami seemed like an entirely different species, not fellow Europeans. The success was immediate and overwhelming. Hagenbeck realized he had created something new, an exhibition that blurred the line between science, entertainment, and colonial propaganda. And so he set out to expand it. Next came the Nubians from Sudan, skilled archers and horsemen whom Hagenbeck marketed as fierce warriors. Posters depicted them with exaggerated muscles, weapons raised, eyes burning with intensity. The reality was far different. Many were farmers, artisans, or traders, but facts mattered little. What mattered was the story he sold. Then came the Inuit, then the Samoans, then the Aboriginal Australians, then the Somalis. Each group was displayed with painstakingly crafted environments, costumes, and routines designed to appeal to European prejudices. Specific tribes were chosen to represent certain stereotypes: noble warrior, childlike primitive, fierce hunter, exotic dancer. Hagenbeck's exhibitions became so popular that they toured across Europe for decades. In Vienna, the crowds lined up before dawn. In Paris, newspapers printed full-page spreads about the strange people arriving by train. In London, people climbed onto rooftops for a better view of the processions. These exhibitions changed everything. They cemented racial hierarchies in the minds of millions. They transformed colonized peoples into living caricatures. They presented entire cultures as static, primitive, and unchanging. Worst of all, they normalized the idea that some humans belonged in cages. Behind the scenes, however, the performers lived lives filled with indignity, exhaustion, and sometimes terror.
Daily routines were rigidly scheduled. Every morning, performers were told what to wear, what to cook, what to perform, what rituals to enact, many of which had no basis in their true traditions. They were characters in someone else's script. Privacy was almost non-existent. Their living quarters, often small wooden huts, were treated as part of the exhibition. Visitors would peek inside, comment on their belongings, even photograph them while they slept. Health conditions were horrendous. Europe's cold winters were lethal to performers from tropical climates. Pneumonia and tuberculosis spread quickly. Many fell ill. Some died. When a performer passed away, they were often buried in unmarked graves far from home, forgotten by the audiences who had once admired them. Pay was inconsistent or non-existent. Contracts, when they existed at all, were written in European languages the performers could not read. Most never received what they were promised. Children suffered terribly. They were forced into performances, photographed excessively, and subjected to the same grueling schedules as adults. Infant mortality was horrifyingly common. But none of this reached the crowds. Visitors only saw the bright surface, the illusion of primitive life presented as authentic. The exhibitions didn't just entertain, they educated. They taught Europeans to believe in the superiority of their own civilization, reinforcing colonial ideology and racial hierarchy. This was not merely a show. This was propaganda on an industrial scale. And the effect was devastating. Art schools sent students to sketch the performers. Scientists visited to take measurements and photographs. Politicians used the exhibitions to justify colonial expansion. Church groups framed them as proof that heathens needed conversion. The exhibitions shaped textbooks, policies, stereotypes, and social beliefs for generations. It is impossible to overstate how deeply these savage shows embedded themselves into European culture. They became part of the national identity, evidence of empire's reach. They created the illusion that Europeans were benevolent observers of lesser worlds.
But behind every performance, every choreographed dance, every act of forced authenticity was a simple, unchanging truth. The people being displayed were human, with memories, with families, with home landscapes that were oceans away. And they were breaking. Some tried to escape, some rebelled, some refused to perform. Some retreated into silence. Many never returned home. Europe's appetite for these exhibitions was insatiable, and the industry grew until it consumed thousands of lives across decades. But even as the shows flourished, even as profits soared and crowds cheered, a new and even darker chapter was brewing within this world of cages and colonial fantasies: the exploitation of children in human zoos. Their stories are among the most heartbreaking in the entire history of this phenomenon. Welcome back. Tonight's chapter turns toward a truth so disturbing, so raw, that even in the darkest corners of human history, it is often whispered rather than spoken aloud. Because when human zoos spread across Europe and America, they did not spare the most vulnerable. They did not show mercy to the young. They did not hesitate to display children, infants, toddlers, and adolescents before hungry crowds. This is the chapter that reveals how innocence was taken, reshaped, and sold as spectacle. This is the chapter of the stolen childhoods. When we think of human zoos, we often imagine adult performers. But in reality, a shocking number of exhibitions relied heavily on children. Their presence made the displays more appealing to audiences who viewed them not only as exotic curiosities, but as living proof of racial hierarchies. To the crowds, children were cute, interesting, wild, or unusual. To the showmen, they were profitable. To the empires expanding across Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and the Americas, they were simply another tool. And the tragedies that followed were relentless.
Some children arrived in Europe or America with larger groups brought from their homelands. Others were taken under far more sinister circumstances. Colonial officers, missionaries, and show organizers sometimes negotiated with local intermediaries, chiefs, traders, or exploiters who offered children in exchange for money, goods, or promises of return that were never honored. In more brutal cases, children were abducted outright. This was especially common in regions ravaged by conflict or slave raids. Villages destroyed by colonial violence left behind orphans, alone, frightened, without protection. Showmen saw opportunity in their vulnerability. They claimed to rescue the children by offering them roles in exhibitions, but in reality, they were transporting them into cages and performances thousands of miles from home. And once taken, escape was almost impossible. The dark trend of displaying children emerged early in the world of human exhibitions. When Carl Hagenbeck launched his traveling ethnographic shows, he quickly realized that adding children to the cast increased attendance dramatically. In Hamburg, where many of his exhibitions began, audiences grew particularly enamored with performances by families. Parents and their children presented as though they were living relics from some distant, untouched world. Posters often featured the youngest performers in exaggerated traditional clothing, described as miniature savages or little warriors. The reality was harsher than any advertisement. Children were forced to perform the same routines as adults, dancing on command, sitting in enclosures for hours, allowing themselves to be photographed incessantly, posing with props they had never used in their lives. They were rarely allowed rest, rarely allowed privacy, rarely allowed childhood. Europe's climate was deadly for many of the children brought from Africa, Oceania, and Southeast Asia. Winter storms swept through cities like Hamburg, Berlin, Brussels, and Copenhagen. Cold so fierce it cut through their thin costumes, the very costumes that show organizers forced them to wear even in freezing temperatures. Children would shiver uncontrollably as they stood in artificial villages for the entertainment of the crowds. Their bodies, unaccustomed to the cold, weakened rapidly. Pneumonia became the silent killer. One after another, children fell ill. Some died backstage. Some died in overcrowded quarters. Some died in hospitals where no one spoke their language. Some died without ever hearing their parents' voices again. Their deaths were often minimized or hidden. Organizers replaced them quickly, sometimes recruiting new children from the next tour location. Burial practices were equally tragic. Because few of these children had anyone to advocate for them, their bodies were often interred in mass graves or unmarked plots. In Hamburg alone, dozens of children from Hagenbeck's exhibitions are believed to lie buried in forgotten corners of old cemeteries. The public never questioned the disappearances. The shows continued without pause.
If there is one place where the tragedy of child performers reached its peak, it was Belgium. The Belgian Empire's exploitation of the Congo Free State was infamous for its brutality. Forced labor, severed hands, mass killing, starvation, and widespread kidnapping. It was in this context that Belgian showmen and politicians created some of the most grotesque human zoo displays ever recorded. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Belgium imported numerous Congolese children to display at exhibitions in Brussels, Antwerp, Liège, and Taverne. Some came with their communities. Some were orphans taken during violent raids. Others were outright stolen. The 1897 Taverne exhibition, a massive colonial show within a world fair, featured several Congolese children displayed near artificial lakes and huts. They were ordered to paddle boats, sing, or dance for crowds that sometimes exceeded 100,000 visitors in a single day. Their suffering was immense. Belgian winters were unforgiving. Malnutrition was rampant. Medical care was limited or non-existent. 7 children died during the exhibition. Their bodies were quietly buried in graves without ceremony. Their names are largely forgotten, fragments in old archives, footnotes in historical accounts. Belgium's official reports dismissed their deaths as unfortunate accidents. But the truth is unmistakable. They were sacrificed to entertain a nation celebrating its imperial conquest. France, too, relied heavily on child performers. At the 1889 Paris exhibition, among the many individuals brought from Senegal, Madagascar, Cambodia, and Vietnam, dozens were children. Visitors flocked to see them. French newspapers described them with a mix of fascination and condescension. Some labeled them adorable savages. Others compared them, disturbingly, to pets. Many articles focused on their physical features, hair texture, eye shape, height, as though they were cataloging new species. Photographs of these children were reproduced on postcards sold throughout the fairgrounds. These cards circulated for decades, and many still survive in antique markets today. Disturbing relics of a world where child exploitation was commemorated as novelty. For the children themselves, life at the Paris Fair was grueling. Crowds pressed close, trying to touch them. Tourists demanded photos. Showmen gave instructions in languages they could not understand. Some children grew terrified of the crowds. Some refused to perform. Some cried so often that organizers sent them backstage, where they were punished or isolated. The fair was supposed to end in celebration. For many children, it ended in trauma.
While Europe's human zoos were more frequent, the United States was not innocent. At the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the Philippine Reservation, which housed more than 1,000 individuals brought from the Philippines, featured hundreds of children. American audiences lined up to see them reenact staged classroom scenes, tribal ceremonies, and mock daily life routines. Anthropologists measured their skulls, photographed them naked, took notes on their behavior, all under the guise of science. Children from the Igorot, Eta, Negrito, and Visayan communities became tools for American imperial propaganda. The U.S. used their presence to justify its colonization of the Philippines, claiming that these children represented primitive peoples in need of American governance. The truth was much more complicated. Many of these children came from sophisticated cultures. Their homes had traditions, hierarchies, education systems, and beliefs far richer than anything the exhibitions portrayed. But none of that mattered to the fair organizers. The children were there to perform, and the crowds were there to believe. In every human zoo, children were assigned roles. They were instructed to smile, laugh, jump, play, or act afraid, whichever emotion best entertained the audience. If a culture was depicted as warlike, children were handed tiny spears. If a culture was portrayed as gentle, children were given baskets or musical instruments. Their every gesture became a spectacle. Some children tried to rebel. They refused to be props, but rebellion was dangerous. Children who resisted were isolated, punished, or threatened. Organizers insisted that performances continue, even if a child was sick or exhausted. Their days were long. Their nights were cold. Their futures were fragile. The saddest truth is this: many children had no concept of where they were or why they were there. Their memories of home faded. Their languages weakened. Their identities became tangled with the roles they were forced to play. For some, the human zoo was the only childhood they ever knew.
When the exhibitions ended, not all children returned home. Some were abandoned in foreign countries. Some were adopted by families who saw them as trophies. Some were placed in orphanages. Some simply vanished from the record. Trauma followed those who did return. They struggled to reintegrate into their communities, who often viewed them with confusion or suspicion. Many had forgotten their native languages. Many were marked by grief, illness, or permanent injury. Children who had been displayed as curiosities carried those scars for life, and yet their stories are rarely told, because history prefers to remember the spectacle, not the suffering, the crowds, not the cages, the applause, not the cries. Tonight, the silence breaks. The global fascination with human exhibitions did not stop with children, however. Behind every performance was another layer of cruelty, one that disguised itself as science. Into the laboratories, the photography rooms, and the anthropologists' tents where human beings, children and adults alike, were measured, ranked, and cataloged like specimens. Welcome back. Tonight, we step into a realm colder than cages and darker than any exhibition hall, because behind every hut, every fake village, every primitive dance, and every staged ritual of the human zoos, there was another force shaping the world's perception of entire peoples, a force draped in the authority of academia, armed with rulers, calipers, cameras, and theories that claimed to reveal the secrets of humanity itself. This is the chapter where science became a weapon, where curiosity became cruelty, where classrooms, laboratories, and museums became silent accomplices in dehumanization. Welcome to the era of scientific racism, the engine that powered human zoos. By the late 19th century, Europe and America were intoxicated with new sciences. Evolutionary theory had shaken the world. Anthropology was emerging as a formal discipline. Anatomists and biologists raced to classify every organism on Earth. And in that environment, a disturbing idea took hold. Humans could be measured, ranked, and sorted, just like animals. Enter the anthropologists. Enter the race scientists. Enter the institutions that saw human zoos not as moral outrage, but as golden research opportunities. Crowds came to watch. Scientists came to measure. Governments came to justify empire. And the people inside the cages became data points in theories designed to prove their inferiority.
Key figures in early anthropology believed the human body held the answers to everything: intelligence, behavior, morality, even destiny. And so laboratories and field camps were filled with strange instruments: skull calipers, facial protractors, measuring tapes, color charts. Scientists descended upon human exhibits with enthusiasm. They measured skull width, they measured arm length, they measured leg proportions, they measured noses, ears, lips, jaws. They mapped hair texture, they cataloged skin tone. Every measurement became a number, every number became proof, and every proof justified colonial ideology. These scientists claimed to be objective, but their conclusions were predetermined. They sought confirmation, not truth. They wanted validation of the belief that Europeans were the pinnacle of human evolution. Human zoos gave them exactly what they needed: people from colonized lands, isolated, deprived, and forced into artificial circumstances that reinforced stereotypes. To race scientists, this was not exploitation, it was opportunity. Photography, a relatively new technology, became another weapon. Scientists and ethnographers took thousands of photographs of performers in human zoos, often forcing them to pose naked or nearly naked. These images were cataloged into racial atlases, books that claimed to show the hierarchy of humanity, books that were used in universities for decades, books that influenced policies, segregation, immigration laws, and public opinion. Each photograph stripped the subjects of individuality. Names disappeared, stories disappeared, humanity disappeared. They became types, frozen in time, categorized like museum specimens. This was not science. This was propaganda disguised as research.
The obsession with classification led to even darker practices. Museums across Europe collected human remains, skulls, bones, entire skeletons from colonized regions. Some were acquired through grave robbery, others through violent conquest. Some were taken from people who had died in human zoos. These remains were placed in glass cases, studied by students, or stored in basements for future research. The most disturbing cases involved the transformation of human remains into anatomical displays, detailed models of skull shapes, facial angles, and supposedly primitive features. Visitors gawked at them. Scientists lectured about them. Governments used them. And the world believed them. As Darwin's theory of evolution spread, a group of thinkers distorted it into a brutal social philosophy, social Darwinism. The idea was simple and cruel, that human races competed for survival and that Europeans were more evolved. This ideology explained away colonization as natural. It justified human zoos as educational. It rationalized exploitation as inevitable. If Europeans believed they were advanced, then someone else had to be placed below them. Human zoos created the visual proof. Anthropologists and doctors frequently treated the performers in human zoos as experimental subjects. They performed physical examinations that were humiliating, invasive, or outright abusive. They took blood samples. They took hair samples. They copied tattoos. They forced performers to undergo endurance tests. They recorded speech patterns, often mocking them. Some experiments were disguised as medical checkups. Others were presented as academic tests. Many were simply exploitation. Children were measured as obsessively as adults. Babies were photographed naked. Infants were weighed and examined, all without consent. And every piece of data collected was twisted to reinforce the belief in European superiority.
Scientists insisted that performers reenact cultural rituals, even if those rituals were misunderstood, exaggerated, or entirely invented. If a group was believed to be warlike, organizers forced them to perform mock battles. If a group was romanticized as noble savages, they were instructed to appear peaceful, simple, innocent. Science dictated the script. Anthropologists wrote the descriptions on posters. Museum directors approved the costumes. Showmen enforced the routines. Entire cultures were reduced to stereotypes justified by pseudoscience. Perhaps the darkest consequence of all was the way these studies shaped public policy. Data from human zoos contributed directly to racial segregation laws, colonial governance structures, immigration restrictions, forced assimilation programs, eugenics movements, medical discrimination, educational hierarchies, criminal justice biases. The charts, photographs, and measurements collected in exhibition grounds were cited in academic journals and government reports. They became evidence that shaped the modern world. In truth, they were nothing more than racism dressed in the clothing of science. Universities, museums, and scientific societies rarely questioned these practices. Instead, they funded expeditions, printed studies, and trained students to continue the work. Some institutions still hold the remains of individuals taken from human zoos. Some still possess anatomical models created from performers' bodies. Some still store photographs never returned to families. Only recently have countries begun to acknowledge this past. And even now, the apologies are hesitant, the reparations incomplete.
Those who survived human exhibitions carried deep wounds. They spoke of humiliation,
They remembered the cold metal of measuring devices. They remembered being ordered to stand still, to open their mouths, to lift their arms, to turn their heads, to let strangers press calipers against their skin. They remembered laughter. They remembered judgment. They remembered the moment they realized they were not being studied as equals, but as objects. Science did not elevate them, it reduced them. And for many, the trauma lasted a lifetime. Perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the scientists of the time did not see themselves as villains. They believed they were documenting evolution, preserving humanity's diversity, advancing knowledge. But their work built the structure of racism that would define the 20th century. Segregation, apartheid, forced sterilizations, and more. Human zoos gave these ideas a stage. Science gave them legitimacy. Society gave them applause. And entire populations paid the price. But behind all the scientific charts lies another layer, one driven not by curiosity, but by commerce. Because there was money in cages. And in the next chapter, we follow the money. We enter the machinery of profit, where human beings were turned into commodities in an industry that grew rich from their suffering.
Welcome back. Tonight, the lights brighten, the crowds swell, and the machinery of spectacle reveals its gleaming gears. Because behind every cage, every poster, every staged tribal village, every forced ritual and exotic performance, there was an engine roaring beneath the surface. An engine fueled not merely by curiosity or scientific arrogance, but by something far more familiar: profit. Money didn't just influence the rise of human zoos. It built them. It sustained them. It turned them into one of the most lucrative industries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Tonight, we peel back the velvet curtains to expose the empire of wealth, marketing, and political power that transformed human lives into a commerce of spectacle. To understand why human zoos spread so quickly, follow the money. When the first ethnographic exhibitions opened, the numbers shocked the organizers. Crowds lined the streets. Tickets sold out for days. Newspapers couldn't print stories fast enough to satisfy public hunger. What began as small curiosities became overnight sensations. The formula was simple. Take people from colonized lands, place them in fabricated primitive villages, add costumes, props, and performances, then charge the public to stare. The profit margins were enormous. Organizers quickly realized that human zoos required fewer resources than animal displays. People ate simpler food, required minimal enclosure construction, and needed fewer caretakers. They could perform multiple times a day, draw larger audiences, and fit into almost any space. To the entrepreneurs who ran these shows, it felt like the perfect business model, and they scaled it with ruthless efficiency. One name towers above all others in the history of human exhibitions: Karl Hockenbeck, the German entrepreneur whose touring shows attracted millions of spectators across Europe. Hockenbeck did not see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a businessman. He built an empire on 3 pillars: exotic animals, lions, elephants, tigers, bears; exotic people, Nubians, Sami, Somali, Inuit, Aboriginal Australians; and exotic performances, choreographed dances, mock hunts, staged rituals. He blended all 3 into a single traveling spectacle: part circus, part zoo, part ethnographic exhibition. He marketed his shows as authentic glimpses of vanishing cultures. but authenticity was the last thing on his mind.
The posters featured exaggerated images, warriors with sharpened spears, women dressed in minimal clothing, children smiling as if living in paradise. Everything was carefully designed to appeal to European fantasies. And his profits soared. Newspaper archives show that Hagenbeck's exhibitions often earned more money than circuses, theaters, and even major public events. His shows traveled across Germany, France, Denmark, England, Italy, and Austria. In some cities, the lines wrapped around entire city blocks. Hagenbeck grew so wealthy that he later built one of the most influential zoos in the world, the Tierpark Hagenbeck in Hamburg, Germany, using money earned directly from displaying human beings. Few people know this today. Even fewer talk about it. Governments soon realized that human zoos were more than entertainment. They were propaganda tools, and profitable ones. World fairs and colonial exhibitions brought in millions of visitors, generating staggering revenue from ticket sales, food vendors, souvenir stalls, postcards, photographs, guided tours, and corporate partnerships. Paris, Brussels, London, Berlin. Cities competed fiercely for the title of largest or most exotic fair. The 1889 Paris Exposition, for example, earned an astonishing amount of money from its human zoos. The 1907 Colonial Exhibition in Marseille drew nearly 2 million visitors. The 1958 Brussels Expo, shockingly recent, featured Congolese performers and sold merchandise depicting them. Revenue poured in from every corner of the fairgrounds. Human beings were generating more profit than many industrial exhibits. Human zoos didn't just sell tickets, they sold souvenirs. Postcards were among the most profitable. They depicted men, women, and children as exotic novelties. These cards were mass-produced, sold in booths, and mailed across the world. In some cases, performers were forced to pose for hundreds of photos a day.
Other merchandise included miniature figurines of native warriors, posters featuring exaggerated images, printed tribal dictionaries, pamphlets describing made-up rituals, illustrated books, maps of colonial territories, replicas of primitive tools. Every trinket turned a real human being into a caricature, and every caricature turned a profit. Some performers signed contracts. Most didn't understand them. Many never saw a single coin. Contracts, when they existed, were often written in European languages. Payments were inconsistent. In some cases, organizers withheld wages until the end of the tour, ensuring performers could not leave. Others were not paid at all. Showmen argued that room and board constituted the performer's compensation. The reality was starvation-level diets, overcrowded quarters, and harsh living conditions. Money flowed into the pockets of organizers, not into the hands of the people being exhibited. Human zoos attracted powerful allies. Shipping companies sponsored the transport of performers. Railroad systems advertised travel to exhibitions. Newspapers promoted shows in exchange for exclusive access. Political leaders used fairs to promote colonial pride. Some exhibitions had royal endorsements. The industry wasn't fringe, it was mainstream, respectable, socially accepted. This is one of the most disturbing truths. The world's most educated, wealthy, and powerful people eagerly supported human zoos.
While the businessmen grew rich, the crowds played an equal role in sustaining the system. Tickets were cheap. Entertainment was limited. Curiosity was high. Families brought children on weekends. Teachers organized school trips. Artists came to sketch. Scientists came to study. Politicians came to brag about empire. The sheer volume of visitors kept the fairs profitable year after year. Millions participated. None questioned the ethics. Or if they did, their voices were drowned out by applause. Meanwhile, the people inside the cages paid the ultimate price. Many were overworked to exhaustion. Performances could run for 12 to 14 hours a day. Illness was treated as inconvenience. Deaths were dismissed as statistics. When a performer died, exhibitions rarely halted. A replacement was found. A new group recruited. The show went on. In the ledgers of showmen, performers were not people. They were inventory. And inventory could always be replenished. Human zoos did more than generate money. They shaped ideology. The profits proved to governments that the public supported empire. This justified increased colonial spending, expansion, and exploitation. Colonized peoples were dehumanized not only for entertainment, but as part of a larger political machine. Human zoos created a visual argument for inequality, a spectacle that reinforced racial hierarchies, a living justification for domination. And the more money the industry made, the louder its pseudo-scientific claims echoed.
For every coin that clinked into a ticket booth, there was a price paid elsewhere. Broken families, lost children, illnesses untreated, deaths buried in silence, identities erased, cultures misrepresented, trauma carried across lifetimes. The human zoo industry did not merely exploit people. It reshaped global perceptions of entire races. It made the world believe a lie so powerful that it still influences societies today. By the early 20th century, human zoos were at their height. Profits were soaring, audiences were growing, governments were proud, showmen were wealthy. But cracks were beginning to form. Whispers of resistance emerged. Journalists began to question the morality. Some scientists spoke out. Activists protested. And survivors themselves, those who endured the cages, carried stories too powerful to ignore. Their voices, long suppressed, would become the seeds of change. Because behind the spectacle of profit were human beings with memories, pain, dignity, and longing. Welcome back. Tonight we step beyond the fences, beyond the crowds, beyond the propaganda and posters and ticket booths, and enter the only place where the truth of human zoos can be fully understood, the hearts and memories of the people who lived inside them. For decades, their voices were muted by the roar of spectacle. Their stories were buried under the applause of millions. Their pain was hidden behind the polished veneer of education and entertainment. But now, the silence breaks. This chapter is not about theories or crowds or scientists. It is about them, the men, women, and children who became exhibits, the people whose humanity endured even when the world tried to deny it. Their testimonies are rare, scattered through letters, missionary reports, newspaper archives, court cases, and oral traditions. Many performers died without leaving a single written word, but the fragments they left behind are powerful, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore. These are their voices. One of the earliest documented testimonies comes from a Nubian man displayed in Germany in the late 1800s. His words, recorded years later by a missionary who befriended him, are simple but devastating. We were not allowed to disappear from their sight. Even when we slept, people stared. Hagenbeck's exhibitions, which toured through Hamburg, Berlin, and Munich,
placed performers in huts with open windows. Spectators would lean in, point, laugh, and take notes. Some tried to touch their belongings. Some stuck their hands inside the huts to feel their hair or skin. Another Nubian performer recalled, "I felt like a bird trapped in a cage, waiting for the world to judge my feathers." He spoke of cold nights without blankets, long days of performing mock rituals he had never practiced back home, and the humiliation of being watched while eating unfamiliar European food that left him sick. These were not isolated memories. They echoed across continents. A Sami woman displayed alongside her family in a Scandinavian exhibition explained the psychological toll on her children. Her diary entries survived only because a linguist later translated them. They clung to me when the visitors arrived. The noise scared them, the stares frightened them. They did not understand why people watched them like animals. She described strangers trying to photograph the children while they slept, sometimes without consent. When her youngest developed a fever, the show doctor brushed it off as stage exhaustion. The child later died. Her grief fills the pages. "I wanted to bury my child in our land, under our sky. Instead, I buried him here, under theirs." The exhibitions rarely stopped for funerals. The show continued as scheduled. Death was an inconvenience for organizers, an opportunity to recruit replacements.
One of the most haunting testimonies comes from an Aboriginal Australian man displayed in Europe during a Hagenbeck tour in the early 1900s. His story was collected decades later by his grandchildren, who preserved his oral history. He recalled, "They made me dance the way they thought I should dance. When I refused, they beat me. Not hard, but enough to remind me who owned my time." He described being forced to reenact a battle every afternoon, wielding a spear against another performer while the crowd cheered. "It was not our culture they wanted," he said. "It was their fantasy of our culture. They did not care who we were." He also spoke of loneliness. "At night, I whispered into the darkness, calling my ancestors. I asked them to remember me, even if the world forgot." The world did forget, until now. Many Filipino performers at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair left behind oral accounts collected by later historians. One testimony from a boy, later recorded as an adult, reveals the harshness of daily life. "We ate scraps. American food made us sick. Some days there was no food at all because the showman said we had not performed with enough spirit." He described being forced to reenact a battle every afternoon, wielding a spear against another performer while the crowd cheered. "It was not our culture they wanted," he said. "It was their fantasy of our culture. They did not care who we were." He also spoke of loneliness. He remembered children crying from hunger. He remembered adults begging for medicine. He remembered the cold nights when thin costumes offered no protection. The fair lasted 7 months. For him, it felt like 7 years. A Kanak woman from New Caledonia was among those displayed at the 1931 Paris Colonial Exhibition, the same exhibition that hosted one of the last large-scale human zoos in Europe. She later recounted her story to her daughter, who wrote it down. "We performed every day. I grew sick. I asked to go home. They told me I had signed a contract. I did not understand their language. I did not know what I had signed." Her voice trembles through the page.
I thought I would die in France."
She survived, but others did not. Records show that several performers from the same group died during the exhibition and were buried in France without returning home. Their families waited for letters that never arrived.
Inuit performers displayed in Europe often suffered extreme psychological shock. One man from Greenland, later interviewed by Scandinavian ethnographers, described his terror at the crowds. "So many faces, so many eyes. It felt like the world was eating me." Inuit participants struggled in the European heat. Their traditional clothing, heavy furs, became unbearably hot on stage. Organizers refused to let them remove it because it ruined the authentic look. One performer fainted repeatedly during shows. Instead of sending him to a doctor, organizers simply ended his performance early and instructed him to sit by the edge of the enclosure so visitors could observe him resting in his natural repose. He later said, "My body was there. My spirit hid itself." For every survivor's voice that reaches us, dozens more are lost. Lost children who died of pneumonia. Lost mothers buried in foreign soil. Lost fathers who never returned home. Lost performers reduced to footnotes. Their stories echo only faintly in archives. A line in a ledger. A mention in a medical report. A burial entry in a cemetery list. A fading photograph in a forgotten attic. The silence of the dead may be the most powerful testimony of all. Despite everything, humiliation, forced performances, sickness, loss, many performers held on to their humanity in ways the world failed to see. They formed friendships across cultures. They whispered songs from home at night. They taught each other words in their languages. They prayed, meditated, chanted, or sang quietly behind closed doors. They passed stories to their children. They dreamed of returning home. One performer from Sudan said, "They thought they could own my body. They could not own my soul." And perhaps that is the tragedy and beauty of these testimonies, that even when the world reduced them to exhibits, they remained human. The voices inside the cage remind us of a moral truth the world tried to ignore. They were not performers, not curiosities, not objects, not types, not specimens. They were individuals, with families, with pasts, with futures stolen from them.
Welcome back. Tonight we cross the Atlantic again, not to the cages of Europe, but to a nation that saw itself as the rising torchbearer of progress, modernity, and global influence. A nation that proudly declared liberty and equality while simultaneously building one of the largest human exhibition systems in the world. This is the chapter where the United States steps onto the stage, where the myths of manifest destiny, civilizing missions, and American exceptionalism provide the perfect soil for human zoos to flourish. Because if Europe invented the industry, America perfected the spectacle. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America was booming. Cities expanded rapidly, technology advanced at lightning speed, immigration reshaped demographics, and the country's political ambitions stretched beyond its borders into the Caribbean, the Pacific, and Asia. With industrial growth came entertainment culture. Vaudeville shows, circuses, dime museums, Wild West extravaganzas, and the unstoppable rise of world's fairs. Americans loved spectacle. Big, loud, dramatic spectacle. So when human zoos appeared in Europe, the United States didn't question the ethics. It saw an opportunity. Promoters, politicians, and showmen declared, "We can do it bigger. We can do it better.
we can do it more impressively. And they did. Before official human zoos took root, one figure laid the foundation: Buffalo Bill Cody, the showman behind the legendary Wild West shows. Beginning in the 1880s, Buffalo Bill toured the country with enormous productions featuring sharpshooters, performers, and most notably Native American tribes, Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others. These shows mixed fiction with reality, staged battles between cowboys and Indians, choreographed dances labeled as savage rituals, dramatic reenactments of raids, speeches by tribal chiefs that were often scripted. Millions attended the shows across the U.S. and Europe. Some Native performers saw the shows as opportunities to travel and earn money. Others felt exploited, misrepresented, and trapped in stereotypes that reinforced the belief that indigenous people were either noble savages or violent threats. Buffalo Bill's shows were not human zoos in the strict sense, but they were the gateway, shaping American minds to view indigenous cultures as entertainment rather than as nations with complex histories. By the dawn of the 20th century, America was ready for something even more elaborate and far more grotesque.
The Louisiana Purchase Exposition, better known as the St. Louis World's Fair, was a marvel of engineering and spectacle. It featured innovations in electricity, automobiles, and architecture. But its main attraction? The largest human zoo ever created in the United States. The fair showcased over 1,100 Filipinos brought from the newly colonized Philippine Islands. The U.S. had taken the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, and the government was eager to justify its control abroad. The solution? Turn colonized people into exhibits. The fair's organizers built an enormous Philippine reservation, a 47-acre human display with multiple villages representing ethnic groups such as Igorot, Aita, Negrito, Moro, Visayan, Bagobo, and Ifugao. Each group was assigned a scripted role, complete with costumes, daily performances, and staged rituals. Visitors walked through these villages as if touring a museum. Anthropologists measured skulls. Journalists took photos. Children pointed and laughed. Scientists wrote papers calling Filipinos outlines of human evolution. And all of this was presented as patriotism, proof that America was fulfilling its duty to civilize. The Igorot people from the mountainous regions of northern Luzon were the most heavily exploited group at the fair. Organizers exaggerated their rituals, especially the consumption of dog meat, to shock and entertain American audiences. In reality, dog eating was not a central part of Igorot culture. It was not a daily ritual. It was treated as a cultural ceremony, not street food. But sensationalism sold tickets. Fair organizers forced Igorot performers to kill and eat dogs on a schedule, turning a cultural tradition into a grotesque spectacle. Newspapers published headlines like, "Savage Feast at the Fair," "Igorots devour dogs before shrieking crowd." Millions visited the Igorot display. Millions internalized the propaganda. To the American public, the Igorots became the perfect example of primitive people needing American rule. The show wasn't entertainment. It was political theater.
The St. Louis Fair also displayed the Ainu, indigenous people from northern Japan. They were placed next to the Philippine exhibit and portrayed as another primitive race. Ironically, the Japanese government opposed this portrayal. Japan wanted recognition as a modern world power and feared that presenting the Ainu as indigenous others
would harm their national image. The U.S. ignored Japan's complaints. Profit mattered more than diplomacy. American museums, especially the Smithsonian Institution, used the fair as an opportunity to gather data. Anthropologists measured skulls, took plaster face molds, collected cultural artifacts, photographed people in forced poses. These exhibits influenced U.S. racial policies for decades. They supported segregation, they bolstered eugenics movements, they justified imperial expansion. Scientific racism didn't just accompany human zoos, it fed on them. Performers lived in cramped conditions, separated from most Americans by fences. They were required to perform daily routines, whether or not these routines reflected their real lives. Many suffered from malnutrition, loneliness, illness, and cold weather exposure. Some died at the fairgrounds. Records were vague, burials were unmarked. And when the fair ended, not all performers returned home. Some were lost, some disappeared into American cities, some were placed in orphanages, some died before departure. The fair closed its gates. America moved on. The performers carried the trauma.
The St. Louis Fair was not the end, only the beginning. In New York, the amusement empire of Coney Island opened human exhibitions featuring exotic babies, African performers, Filipino performers, indigenous groups from South America, and Eskimo villages, often Inuit and Aleut communities. These were smaller, but no less disturbing. Crowds flocked to them after enjoying roller coasters or freak shows. Human lives were simply another attraction. Human displays continued in American zoos as well. The most infamous was Ota Benga, caged in the Bronx Zoo, but he wasn't the only one. Other zoos displayed Native Americans, African groups, and indigenous performers from Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Many Americans do not know this history. It is conveniently forgotten. But the archives remember. Most Americans accepted these exhibitions without question. Schools organized visits, church groups attended fairs, professional societies praised the shows. Newspapers printed glowing reviews. The public wanted entertainment, and human exhibitions delivered. Dissent existed, but it was small, often ignored, sometimes mocked. It would take decades before America recognized the moral horror it had embraced. Human zoos in the United States reveal a painful truth. America projected itself as a beacon of freedom, but within its borders, it placed colonized people behind fences, measured their bodies, laughed at their rituals, and called it science. Human zoos were more than spectacles. They were reflections of America's deepest contradictions, contradictions that continue to shape the nation today. But even as the industry's power reached its peak, resistance was growing. Voices rose, slowly at first, then louder, challenging the ethics, the science, and the cruelty of these exhibitions. And soon, the era of applause would begin to crumble.
Welcome back. Tonight, the roar of the crowds begins to falter. The posters fade. The applause grows uneasy. And for the first time in decades, the great machinery of human zoos, the cages, the colonial villages, the pseudoscientific measurements, the forced performances, begins to face something it had never truly encountered before: opposition. It did not happen all at once. It did not come from governments or from the powerful institutions that benefited from the exhibitions. It began quietly, whispers in church basements, comments in newspaper margins, uncomfortable glances exchanged in front of cages. Yet those whispers would grow into voices, those voices into arguments, those arguments into movements, and eventually those movements would bring the human zoo industry crashing down. Tonight we explore the first cracks in the spectacle. Long before academics and politicians dared oppose human zoos, it was religious leaders, especially within Black and immigrant communities, who condemned the exhibitions. At the 1906 Bronx Zoo display of Ota Benga, New York's Black clergy were the first to shout publicly, "This is a crime against God and humanity." Reverend James H. Gordon, Reverend Robert Stewart MacArthur, and other church leaders accused the zoo of resurrecting slavery under a modern disguise. They wrote letters, organized protests, and demanded Benga's release. Their outrage forced newspapers to cover the issue, forced the zoo to respond, forced the city to confront its own hypocrisy. This was one of the earliest organized attacks on human zoos in America, and it worked. Ota Benga was eventually freed, not because the zoo cared, but because public pressure grew too loud to ignore. This early victory proved something crucial. Human zoos were vulnerable. In Europe, similar dissent began to appear. Some journalists, initially fascinated by the exhibitions, slowly turned critical as they learned the conditions performers endured. A few began writing articles that questioned the morality of the ethnographic villages. In France, the influential newspaper Le Petit Parisien published an exposé in the early 1900s describing the inhumane living conditions at colonial exhibitions. Another reporter wrote, "What education is this? We teach our children to look upon men as beasts." These articles didn't stop the exhibitions, but they made the public uncomfortable, and uncomfortable is the enemy of entertainment.
For decades, scientists had enthusiastically supported human zoos. They collected data. They took measurements. They photographed performers. They published papers that reinforced racist hierarchies. But slowly, painfully slowly, some scholars began questioning the validity of their own methods. Anthropologist Franz Boas became one of the first academic voices to challenge the pseudoscience behind human exhibitions. After observing native villages at American fairs, he criticized the staged rituals, the forced costumes, the distortion of cultures, the obvious exploitation. Boas argued that human behavior was shaped by culture, not biology, a revolutionary idea at the time. His challenge threatened the entire intellectual foundation of human zoos. Because once science questioned them, they were no longer education, they were exploitation. Though rare, there were moments when performers themselves resisted. An Aboriginal Australian rebellion. During a German exhibition in the early 1900s, several Aboriginal men refused to perform the savage hunt staged daily for tourists. They told organizers, "This is not our way. We will not lie about ourselves." In retaliation, the showmen cut their food rations and threatened to cancel their return ship tickets. The men stood firm. Word spread to a local journalist who reported, "The performers are treated worse than the animals." The article triggered public anger in Berlin and forced Hagenbeck to adjust the show schedule. It was a small victory, but symbolically immense. The Philippine students of 1904. At the St. Louis World's Fair, a group of Filipino students visiting America were horrified at how their countrymen were being displayed. They called the exhibition a spectacle of humiliation. They wrote letters to newspapers condemning the display as degrading and inaccurate. Their voices helped fuel an early Filipino nationalist movement. Resistance was emerging from within and from very far away.
As the early 20th century progressed, international humanitarian organizations increased pressure on colonial governments. Groups like the Anti-Slavery Society, the International League of Nations Human Rights Committee, various missionary networks, condemned the treatment of performers and the racist stereotypes being reinforced. They argued that human zoos were morally indefensible, psychologically damaging, scientifically fraudulent, politically manipulative. Their reports influenced lawmakers and began turning public opinion. Some of the strongest waves of outrage followed performer deaths, which newspapers could not ignore. Belgium's tragedy. After 7 Congolese children died at the 1897 Tavern exhibition, public discontent swelled. A few politicians questioned whether the imperial project had crossed a line. Germany's Arctic deaths. Inuit performers died of pneumonia during Hagenbeck tours. German doctors reported the deaths, sparking local protests. Paris outrage. At the 1931 Colonial exhibition, the death of a Kanak child gained attention and drew criticism from church leaders. Death made it harder to disguise human zoos as harmless entertainment. The crowds didn't disappear overnight. Human zoos were still popular, but something had changed. People began whispering, "This feels wrong. These are not animals. Why are they treated like this? What are we actually learning?" Conversations shifted. News articles grew cautious. Teachers debated the ethics of field trips. Parents hesitated before bringing children. The sheen of novelty was wearing off. The First World War shattered the illusion of European superiority. Empires faltered. Millions died. The myth of the civilized world collapsed. Suddenly, the sight of humans in cages felt disturbingly close to the horrors unfolding on battlefields. After the war, the world was no longer as eager to believe in racial hierarchies. People questioned the ideologies that had led nations into carnage. Human zoos lost their innocence. They became symbols of the arrogance that had nearly destroyed Europe. But the industry wasn't dead. Not yet. By the 1920s and 1930s, resistance movements grew stronger. Artists ridiculed racial exhibitions. Writers condemned colonial education. Journalists exposed abusive conditions. Churches pushed for equal humanity. Scientists debunked racial pseudoscience. A new international conversation emerged, one about dignity, human rights, and cultural respect. Human zoos no longer felt like entertainment. They felt like evidence of a world that needed to change. And as nations shifted their identities after the war, even the largest exhibitions began to shrink. But shockingly, they did not vanish. Some continued well into the 1930s. One lasted until 1958. Others survived as cultural villages in theme parks until the 1970s. The end was slow, uneven, and painful. But the moral tide had turned, and the once unbreakable cage had begun to crack. Welcome back. Tonight we enter a chapter that does not feel like history at all, because what you are about to hear happened not centuries ago, not in the distant past, but within the lifetimes of millions of people still alive today. Human zoos did not vanish with the Victorian era, nor did they end when the 1900s began. They lingered, evolved, disguised themselves, and quietly persisted through the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, even the 1960s.
Some of the last human zoos happened in a world with cars, cinemas, radios, color photography, televisions, and the United Nations. This is the chapter where we confront a truth the world rarely speaks aloud. Human zoos were not ancient cruelty. They were modern reality. And their final echoes are recent enough to make the present feel complicit. The Paris Colonial Exhibition of 1931 was the largest and most extravagant human zoo ever held in Europe. It sprawled across acres of carefully designed colonial villages, each dedicated to a different region of the French Empire. North Africa, Indochina, Madagascar, New Caledonia, Cameroon, Congo, Polynesia. More than 100,000 colonized people were transported into France to populate these displays. Many were forced into participation. Others were lured with false promises of wages or education. Some had already been part of earlier exhibitions and were re-recruited as if they were props instead of people. Posters proclaimed, "Visit the world without leaving Paris." Millions did. In the Conic village, children were instructed to run barefoot and perform dances on command. Women were told to cook in open huts while crowds circled, commenting on their clothing and physique. Men reenacted traditional rituals that either had been exaggerated or invented by French organizers. Artificial jungles, fabricated temples, and decorative lakes created the illusion of authenticity, but every detail was staged, every smile rehearsed, every gesture choreographed. This was not representation. This was reenactment of domination. During the exhibition's run, several performers died, most from illness amplified by poor living conditions. Their deaths barely made the news. The show had to go on. Yet even amid the applause and fireworks, the world had begun to shift. Whispers of criticism grew louder. Some French citizens protested, calling the event a living insult to humanity. A group of Indo-Chinese students in Paris published a pamphlet denouncing the exhibition as imperial humiliation disguised as art. But the crowds kept coming. Nearly 34 million people attended. It was a spectacular farewell to an era the world should never have celebrated.
Even as Paris hosted its colossal exhibition, Germany continued its own version of human zoos. Karl Hagenbeck's touring ethnographic shows still drew large audiences, though not quite the crowds of earlier decades. But by the 1930s, the mood had changed. Economic depression cast shadows over Europe. The rise of extremist politics made racial ideologies more dangerous, more weaponized. Some cities began questioning whether human exhibitions were worth the cost or the growing ethical discomfort. Small scandals erupted. A performer injured with no medical care, children collapsing in the cold, a woman's death quietly covered up. Newspapers picked up these stories. Activists took notice. Pastors condemned the shows. The once powerful Hagenbeck empire began to crumble, not out of morality, but out of exhaustion and political distraction as Europe moved toward war. And yet, even then, human displays didn't disappear. They simply migrated. During the 1930s, cultural villages appeared in world fairs, theme parks, and even film productions. Showmen avoided the term human zoo, instead advertising the exhibits as ethnographic shows, cultural demonstrations, native villages, living anthropological museums. The name changed. The cages remained. In Italy, Mussolini's regime built exhibitions of East Africans from Ethiopia and Eritrea, portraying them as loyal subjects of the empire. In Switzerland, traveling shows featuring indigenous groups from Africa and Oceania attracted huge crowds. In Spain, human displays appeared in fairs well into the late 1930s and even resurfaced after the war. World War II paused many exhibitions, but did not kill the idea. One might imagine that the horrors of World War II, genocide, racism, mass violence, would have erased any appetite for human exhibitions. But the post-war world was eager for entertainment, spectacle, and distraction. Colonial nations still held power. Racial ideologies were bruised, not erased. Economic recovery depended on tourism and fairs. Human zoos found ways to return.
Perhaps the most haunting example of the modern era is the 1958 Brussels World's Fair, also known as Expo 58, an event held during the space age in a world with satellites, nuclear energy, and television. Belgium, still controlling the Congo, constructed a large Congolese village at the heart of the expo. The Belgian press advertised it as a unique educational opportunity, but the reality was horrifying. Dozens of Congolese men, women, and children were placed inside a fenced enclosure designed to mimic a stereotypical African village. They were instructed to cook for onlookers, pose for photos, perform songs and dances, refrain from interacting with the Belgian public, and maintain authentic behavior. Crowds pressed their faces against the fence. Children taunted the performers. Some visitors threw coins or food as if feeding animals. A Congolese participant later recalled, "We were told not to speak French. If we answered a visitor in perfect French, they scolded us. They said we were ruining the illusion." The performers rebelled in their own quiet way. They stopped playing their assigned roles. They laughed with visitors. They refused to appear subservient. Some directly protested the degrading conditions. The Belgian organizers panicked. Fearing humiliation, they abruptly closed the exhibit. The Congolese village shut down early, not out of compassion, but out of embarrassment. This was 1958. A year later, the Congo began its struggle for independence.
Even after the collapse of colonial empires, human zoos persisted, reborn as tourist attractions, cultural shows, or theme park exhibitions. Spain, 1960s to 1970s, traveling tribal villages featured performers from Africa and Asia, presented as exotic curiosities. Italy, 1960s. Cultural fairs continued to exhibit primitive peoples from Somalia and Eritrea. Japan, 1970s. Theme parks hosted primitive village attractions using indigenous performers from Asia and the Pacific. France, 1970s. Some ethnographic villages operated within large parks, blending entertainment with colonial nostalgia. These were not officially called human zoos, but they followed the template. Performers in costumes, artificial villages, crowds observing from outside, exoticism as entertainment. The world had not truly changed. It had just learned to package its cruelty more delicately. Even after the final official exhibitions disappeared, the influence lingered. In tourism, in media, in stereotypes, in documentaries that staged tribal life, in museums reluctant to return human remains, in school books filled with distorted portrayals of indigenous cultures. Human zoos shaped how generations viewed race, culture, and identity. The cages are gone, but the shadows remain. Only recently have countries begun acknowledging their role. Germany returned remains of Aboriginal Australians. France apologized for past colonial exhibitions. Belgium confronted its Congo atrocities.
Museums across Europe have begun repatriation. Academic institutions now question their unethical collections. But apologies cannot undo trauma, nor can they resurrect the lost, nor can they give back the stolen years, languages, identities, or lives. Human zoos were not ancient mistakes. They were modern choices. And shockingly, their final curtain fell just a few decades ago. But even in these dark final chapters, a new force was rising, a force strong enough to bring the era to an end. Voices, activism, rebellion, human dignity fighting its way back into the world's conscience.
Welcome back. Tonight we enter the final chapter. The cages are gone. The fairgrounds are silent. The performers have vanished into the soil of foreign lands or been mourned by descendants who never knew their full stories. The posters have faded, the newspapers have crumbled, and the spectators have aged into distant memories. But the legacy of human zoos, it lingers, quietly, uncomfortably, insistently. This is the chapter where the world confronts what it tried so hard to forget, where silence cracks open, where buried histories rise, where the past forces the present to look in the mirror. For human zoos did not simply end. They left a scar on humanity, one that stretches into our museums, our textbooks, our popular culture, our politics, our perceptions. And tonight, we trace that scar. After the last human zoos closed in the mid-20th century, they vanished from public conversation almost instantly. It was not a dramatic reckoning. It was not a loud moral awakening. It was quiet. Too quiet. Governments avoided the topic, museums locked away their archives, textbooks ignored the exhibitions. Teachers never mentioned them. Politicians evaded responsibility. Why? Because acknowledging human zoos meant acknowledging the truth of modern racism and colonialism, not as unfortunate footnotes, but as deliberate systems built and maintained by the same countries that now claim to champion human rights. Europe and America wanted to move forward. The world wanted to modernize, and human zoos became inconvenient ghosts. So they were buried in silence. But silence does not erase history. It only postpones its return.
The first group to break that silence were the families of those who had been displayed. In Australia, descendants of Aboriginal performers began asking, "Where are the bones of our ancestors?" In Greenland, Inuit families searched for graves of loved ones who died on exhibition tours. In Congo, families told stories of children taken to Europe who never returned. In the Philippines, descendants of Igorot performers questioned why their ancestors' images still appeared in American textbooks. Generations carried trauma they could not fully explain, a sense of loss, a sense of shame imposed from outside, a family story whispered but never resolved. As descendants began to seek answers, archives opened, letters resurfaced, photographs appeared online. Newspapers digitized their records. The truth could no longer hide. Museums across Europe held thousands of photographs, recordings, cultural items, and, most disturbingly, human remains collected from exhibitions. Skeletons of people displayed in zoos, skulls measured by pseudoscientists, hair samples taken without consent, cast molds of faces forced onto terrified performers. Many museums avoided the topic for decades, storing these artifacts in basements and back rooms. But as academic and public pressure grew, some institutions finally faced the truth. Germany returned remains of Aboriginal Australians and began examining the provenance of skull collections. France apologized for colonial abuses and allowed repatriation of remains to African and Pacific communities. Belgium admitted the atrocities of the Congo Free State and began revising its museum exhibits. The United States, institutions like the Smithsonian, re-examined their anthropological collections gathered during fairs. This process is slow, messy, incomplete, but it has begun.
Human zoos force countries to confront uncomfortable questions. How did societies that considered themselves civilized embrace such cruelty? How did science become a tool of oppression? Why did millions cheer while humans were placed in cages? What does this history mean for the racism we see today? How do we teach this without creating new wounds? Schools still often avoid the topic. Textbooks rarely mention it. Some countries downplay their involvement. Others frame it as a strange historical curiosity. But human zoos were not curiosities. They were systems, designed, profitable, organized, celebrated. And the ideologies that built them did not vanish with time. They morphed, shifted, hidden themselves in new forms. Human zoos shaped the modern world in subtle yet powerful ways. 1. Racial stereotypes. Many stereotypes that exist today originated in human exhibitions. The savage warrior, the exotic dancer, the primitive tribe, the noble savage, the childlike native. 2. Tourism. Some tribal villages marketed to tourists still use the same language and staging techniques as early exhibitions. 3. Film and media. Hollywood films of the 20th century borrowed heavily from the imagery of human zoos, portraying indigenous peoples as spectacles rather than individuals. 4. Museums. Some ethnographic displays still echo the staged settings of colonial fairs. 5. Science. The legacy of scientific racism influenced medical treatment, criminal justice, and educational systems for decades. The past is not past. Its shadow stretches into the present.
Around the turn of the 21st century, academics, activists, and descendants began pushing harder for recognition. Books were written, documentaries produced, exhibitions revised, governments pressured, museums challenged. The world slowly began to confront the truth of human zoos. Belgium issued a formal apology for its colonial exhibitions. France hosted lectures and debates about its colonial past. Germany opened investigations into human remains in collections. The UN raised awareness about historical racism. Still, no nation has fully reckoned with the extent of this history. Human zoos lasted for more than a century. Millions saw them. Thousands lived and died in them. And their legacy persists. As we close this story, we return to the individuals whose voices guided us. The Aboriginal men who refused to perform false rituals. The Sami mother who buried her child far from home. The Igorot children forced to eat dog meat on schedule. The Inuit performers fainting in European heat. The Kanak woman who begged to go home. The Congolese people displayed in 1958 only yesterday in historical terms. And Ota Benga, whose life ended in unbearable loneliness. Human zoos were not accidents. They were choices. Choices made by societies that convinced themselves they were enlightened. We remember them now, not to reopen wounds, but to ensure the world never closes its eyes again.
History is not just dates and events. It is memory, responsibility, conscience. Human zoos show us what happens when power loses empathy.
when science loses ethics, when entertainment loses humanity, and when societies stop seeing people as people. Their story warns us of what we can become. It reminds us of what we must never become again. And ultimately, it asks each of us a question. When confronted with the suffering of others, do we look away or do we finally see? Thank you for walking through this difficult story. Thank you for honoring the lives that history tried to forget. And thank you for remembering the truth, even when the truth is dark.